Welcome to the Friday edition of Juan's World, and this Friday is Good Friday in the Western Christian tradition. I'd like to talk a little bit about the dating of Easter and all the effects it has had on the calendar, which is not only important to me but to people worldwide, really. So I want to talk about several things. I want to talk about how the dating of Easter got fixed in different traditions, why it got fixed, why it matters for many people in the world who are not particularly Christian. Christmas is a much more important celebration than Easter. But in the church, Easter is the single most important festival in the church. It's what defines Christianity. Christmas is this materialist blowout these days, but it wasn't really important in the early church at all. In fact, for centuries nobody cared, and even once the date of Christmas had been set on December 25th, it still wasn't very important. It wasn't really an important festival until around the 19th century, and largely due to Charles Dickens, in fact, and the Christmas Carol, which we all know excruciatingly well in bits. I don't think many people actually read the whole Christmas Carol, which I do every Christmas. But Dickens was interested in elevating Christmas to a more festive public event. But Easter never got that treatment, and it does have its commercial sides these days. Got plenty of chocolate Easter eggs and bunnies and whatnot, but it still remains more of a church tradition than a secular festival. Now, we can start by just saying that in the Christian tradition, birthdays were never important, and that's why Christmas was never particularly important. If you want to celebrate a particular saint, for example, you don't celebrate their birthday. There are a few exceptions. The birthday of John the Baptist, for example, is one of them. But the vast majority of saints are celebrated on the day they died, because the day they died is thought of as the day that they are elevated to heaven, and that's a day to rejoice about their life. And to some extent, that's also, of course, what Easter is about. So let's talk about the complexities of the dating of Easter and why it's important to us. So you'd think that the dating of Easter ought to be relatively simple, but it isn't. It isn't for many different reasons. One of them is because we don't know exactly the date when Jesus was crucified. This ought to be easy. If we, for example, say that he died on the cross when he was 33 years old, well, we don't really know what year that is. That is, if you calculate the year 1 in the modern era, what used to be called AD. If you calculate the year 1 AD as the year of his birth, and 33 as the year of his death, then you can calculate when Passover was in the year 33, and so you can fix the date when he died. But we're not entirely sure that he was born in the year 1. In fact, there are many scholars who believe he was born in about the year 3 BCE, which is, like the 3 years before he was born. So that's one problem. That means that he would have died in 30, assuming that he died when he was 33 years old, which the Gospels tend to agree upon. Well, that's one thing. So, his actual date of death could be anywhere within a span of about 6 years. So that's no help. The Gospels also suggest that he was crucified in the Passover season of that year, but the Gospels don't agree on the day within the Passover. The synoptic tradition, based on Mark, says that the Last Supper was a Passover meal. And so let's say we fix the date at the year 30, and we can calculate using tables when Passover was in the year 30, and then we can calculate the Last Supper as being the first day of Passover, when they had their Passover meal in the evening. Remember that Jewish calendar calculates the days beginning at sunset and ending at sunset. So by that reckoning, the Last Supper was in the evening of the first day of Passover, and he was crucified the next day, which would be the second day of the Passover. But then John says that the Last Supper was not a Passover meal, that Jesus was crucified at the same time as the Passover lambs were being slaughtered, which would be the day before Passover. So we've got two conflicting traditions concerning what day of Passover Jesus was crucified. We don't really know precisely the year, within plus or minus 3 years, and so forth. So we can't actually fix the specific date at being, let's say, March 30th or April 15th or whatever. We can't do that. But there's another problem, which is that if you actually do find the date and try to fix it for one day, like April 15th, let's say, in the year, then it's not always going to fall on the same day of the week. Which brings us back to Good Friday. The church wanted to have the Last Supper, Good Friday, Easter Sunday, etc., always to fall on the same day of the week. And Passover doesn't do that. Passover can start on any day of the week. But they wanted the day of his crucifixion to fall on a Friday, and so that it would always be Good Friday. You see, the one thing that the Gospels do agree upon is that Jesus was crucified on a Friday during the day. And we know that because all of the traditions tell us that he had to be cut down before sunset, because by Jewish tradition and law, an executed criminal could not be left hanging on the Sabbath. The Sabbath begins at sundown on Friday and continues through until sundown on Saturday. So we know that he was executed during the day on a Friday, and was cut down and put in the tomb on I guess Friday evening, but they couldn't do anything because it was the Sabbath, so that they had to leave him in the tomb all day on the Sabbath, and then by the sundown on the Sabbath it was dark and they couldn't go, and so they went back to the tomb on Sunday morning at sunrise and found it was empty, and giving us the sunrise Easter tradition. Okay, so at least the Synoptic Gospels and John agree on that score. So the early church wanted Easter to always span Friday, Saturday, Sunday. And incidentally, that is why Sunday became the important holy day, what essentially is the Christian Sabbath in place of the Jewish Sabbath, because the Sunday is the day that Jesus was resurrected. And so Sunday replaced Saturday as the day of rest, and is called in Jewish tradition the first day of the week. That is, the Sabbath is the seventh day, the last day of the week. The next day is the first day of the week. And in the Christian tradition, incidentally, it's still the first day of the week. It's not the first day of the work week, it's the first day of the calculated week. So, the early church fathers had all kinds of different ways of calculating Easter, and they couldn't agree for several centuries. They mostly said it as Friday, Saturday, Sunday as a tradition, but different churches in different parts of the Christian world had different ways of calculating when they celebrated Easter. And the Emperor Constantine, who was the first Roman emperor who was a Christian, called the Council of Nicaea in the year 325 to settle a number of issues. The most important issue at the Council of Nicaea was the consideration of whether a heresy known as Arianism was to be accepted or rejected. And that was primarily why it was called. And Constantine, as a Roman emperor, was interested in making sure that the Christians throughout the Roman Empire had uniformity of worship. Constantine was not a particularly Christian emperor, but he accepted Christianity. He also accepted all the other Roman gods, and he was happy with polytheism. And he wasn't especially interested in how the Christian church unified. He just wanted it unified because he wanted his empire unified. And setting the date of Easter was one of those things that had been up in the air for centuries. And the Council of Nicaea also did not exactly fix the date of Easter, but it made one important decision, and that was that Easter and Passover were to be completely separated. They were not to be considered as in any sense related. Very important theological decision. That's where the Council of Nicaea left things. So around that time, and continuing on into later centuries, the general rule that got hit upon with some astronomical quirks here and there was that Easter Sunday should be the Sunday following the the first full moon following the vernal or March equinox. I say vernal, that's spring, because that's what they celebrated in the north. So we call it the March equinox. So that works fairly well. Worked this year. The full moon was Monday. The equinox this year was March 20th. So that's the first full moon after March 20th, and this Sunday is the first Sunday after that full moon. That works most years, even in the using modern astronomy and so forth. But back in the 2nd and to the 6th or 7th centuries, they had different tables that they used for calculating Easter, and those tables were based on mathematical designations of when the equinox fell rather than actual observations. And to an extent, those tables are still used. So you can't always know, if you look up full moons in the year, you can't always know exactly when Easter is, but most of the time you can be fairly sure. So Nicaea made sure that Passover and Easter were not coincident, and that's still pretty much true. It's extremely rare that Easter and Passover have any kind of overlap. Now, if you know anything about calendars, you will know that the Julian calendar, put in place by Julius Caesar, calculates each year as having 365 days, with a leap year every 4 years with an extra day to make up for the fact that the actual solar year is more like 365 and a quarter days. The problem with the Julian calendar is that it's a slightly out. The solar year isn't exactly 365 and a quarter. And so over the course of 15 centuries, the Julian calendar was off by about 8 days from the sun. And so Pope Gregory got his astronomers together, and they decided that they had to extract a number of days from the calendar to get it back in line with the sun. And the only reason they were doing that is to make sure that their calculations of when Easter fell were exact. That's the whole point. Otherwise, nobody would have particularly cared. And so we ended up with the Gregorian calendar. And as you may also know, that the Gregorian calendar was disputed by the Protestant nations of the time, because they thought it was some kind of Catholic conspiracy theory or whatever. And so the Catholic Church, the Catholic countries changed their calendar, I think it was 1585, but it took the United Kingdom and colonies, which included the United States, until 1752 to decide to change their calendar, by which time they had to take 11 days out of the calendar to get it to match up with the sun, the solar motion. Well, not the solar motion, the movement of the Earth around the sun. And that's the calendar we've got today, and that's how we date Easter today. So the dating of Easter has always been vital to the way the calendar works in the Christian tradition. Now, I should also remind you that it's not the only calendar. There is a Jewish calendar which is completely different. There is an Islamic calendar that is completely different, a Buddhist calendar that is completely different. And here in Cambodia we have a Cambodian calendar. Now the great force of global commerce has meant that the Gregorian calendar is more or less universal these days, except when it comes to cultural traditions. Here in Cambodia, we're going to celebrate New Year in about 2 weeks. And it's really quite wonderful living in Cambodia because I get the Gregorian New Year, January 1st. I get the Chinese New Year because there's a very large Chinese population in Cambodia. And I get the Cambodian New Year. And this year I'm teaching from February to May. That means I get a holiday. It's a 3-day holiday for the Cambodian New Year. Great. That brings me to just a final point, which is that calendars have great cultural significance. So the point is that every calendar has cultural significance. The Gregorian calendar sets when we celebrate New Year, when we celebrate Easter, and so forth. The Jewish calendar sets the dates when they celebrate the high holidays, Passover, and Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. The Islamic calendar sets the dates of Ramadan and so forth. And the thing is that if you actually use the calendar that is appropriate for your culture, then everything's fine. Where things go wrong is where your culture celebrates traditions according to one calendar and the secular world celebrates them according to another. And that's a situation for people in most of the world who are Jews or Muslims or Buddhists or Hindus or follow Shinto or whatever, that their own calendar sets their celebrations, their religious festivals and so forth. And for most of the world, it does not synchronize with the Gregorian calendar, which is the Christian calendar. And so you don't know when Ramadan is going to be in relation to the Gregorian calendar because it's moving around. Same with Rosh Hashanah, same with Passover, same with all of these traditions that are outside of the Christian tradition. Which means that in a cultural sense, your culture is less valued than Christian culture. And that's something that is a product of the modern globalized economy. People in China or in India or Saudi Arabia or France or Germany or wherever, they wouldn't care which calendar you used in whatever country you happen to live in if it were not for international trade. You have to be able to set up documents that say something like, we will deliver this particular product on this particular day. Well, if you're using the Islamic calendar and the person you're trying to trade with is using the Buddhist calendar, you're not going to get very far. You all have to use the same calendar. And the simple fact of the matter is that Western Christian culture won the economic war, and because it won the economic war globally, it also has won, in a sense, the cultural war. We use the calendar of the dominant financial empire. See, calendars are about empire. The Julian calendar set by Julius Caesar was universal throughout the Roman Empire, because it was a way to keep the Roman Empire unified, in the same way that Constantine wanted the Christian church to be unified within the empire when he set the Council of Nicaea. So the fact that the whole world uses the Gregorian calendar on a daily basis for just about everything is testament to the fact that Western capitalism is the new empire globally. Now, make of it what you will. It's just making an observation. And I'll have more to say about these kinds of things in coming weeks, I'm sure. But for now, I hope you have a joyous and a happy Easter. And also tell your friends, please like and subscribe. And I'll see you perhaps for a recipe, don't know yet, on Tuesday.